welcome. This is Mr. Fredericks. Today's screencast is on Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, kind of an era of the Cold War. Now, our objective here is to be able to advocate and debate the major decisions of Dwight Eisenhower, essentially judge the man for everything that he did. Also, another objective will be students will be able to complete the matching quiz provided based on the life and times of President Eisenhower. We'll get to more of that at the end of the presentation. So we're going to discuss Eisenhower in his time during the Cold War. It's a long story, so let's kind of talk about where Eisenhower came from. In 1882, Eisenhower was born. Here he is with his family. Seems to have kind of a large head. Trying not to be judgmental, but that said, maybe there was a big brain in there. So he was born in Kansas, but ultimately his family moved to New York, and then Ohio, and then Virginia. Bottom line is, man, we have a lot of presidents from New York. And more presidents from New York than anywhere else. Massachusetts, fourth place. Either way, I don't think there's much significance to that, other than maybe a little interesting. In 1915, Eisenhower joins the U.S. military, but he does not see action in World War I. Now, that is relevant because when it comes to the military and getting promotions, combat experience is highly prioritized. And Eisenhower, when he was in the military, and that made that his career for a very long time, over 20 years, and he never saw combat. So he got a lot of criticism for that. Either way, that would kind of indirectly change. In 1941, when World War II happens, Eisenhower isn't going to see direct combat, but he's already going to be one of the top leaders in the military. In 1942, as commander, he is going to lead Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. He's going to invade Sicily and then Italy. He's going to be super successful, and he's going to gain a lot of accolades and fame from that. Now, as of 1944, he's already kind of famous, but he's going to be chosen as the commander of the D-Day invasion, and that's going to be successful. He's really going to get to heroic proportions at that point. Basically, the invasion of German-held France and the invasion of the rest of Europe, and he's going to free, of course, Europe from Nazi control. Here's Eisenhower on the night before D-Day talking to the troops. Very famous time for him. In 1945, Nazi Germany surrenders, and Eisenhower has become a hero. Absolutely. As of 45, he then takes over the part. As we know, that Germany gets divided into four parts. Eisenhower is tasked with running the U.S. part of Germany. So kind of one of the first decisions Eisenhower is faced with is Germany after World War II is completely destroyed. If you just look at this one image of its cities, German civilians are struggling. And Eisenhower's first major decision was, do I treat these German civilians as the enemy, as Nazis, or do I treat them as victims of the Nazi government, the Nazi military? And the reason why this is so relevant is because they were struggling. They didn't have any food. They didn't have any medical care. So what do we think? What should Eisenhower have done? And I think in the end, Eisenhower chooses to help the German civilians, and the U.S. spends endless amounts of U.S. taxpayer dollars to provide those food, provide that medical care to try to help the Germans back on their feet, which of course later would be helped even further by the Marshall Plan. So kind of decision two that we'll focus on for Eisenhower. In 45, Eisenhower's a hero. We've talked about why. President Truman actually goes to him in 45 and says, listen, if you want to be the next president of the United States, if you want my job, I'll help you get it. I'll even run as your vice presidential candidate. Truman even offers it a second time in 48. Now, the thing is, as he offers that, Eisenhower says no. He says, I'm not a politician. I'm a military guy. Well, in 1948, the Democrats and the Republicans both solicit Eisenhower to run their parties for them, to run for president. He again says no. Truman ends up running and wins for the Democrats in 48. But something starts to change after 1948 with Truman in office. Right before 1952, when there's going to be another presidential election, of course, this is fast forward from World War II by about, 7 years, Eisenhower gets worried. Eisenhower starts to get political. Now, why does he do this? Besides everybody asking him to run their political parties and to run for president, the United States at this point is involved in NATO. In fact, even Eisenhower ran NATO for a time. But the United States, there's lots of people in the U.S. that are like, we need to go back to the way it was. We need to leave NATO. We need to leave the UN. We need to go back to this isolationist spirit. Why is the U.S. getting involved in the war? That's so expensive. That's going to draw us into World War III. No, the U.S. needs to go back to isolationism. So Eisenhower at this point is like, I disagree with that. The U.S. needs to take a leadership role in the world. Nobody else is going to stop communism from growing. Nobody else is going to stop the Soviet Union from getting larger. The U.S. basically is the only country that has the resources to be the police of the world, to stop wrongdoing from expanding. Eisenhower says we can't go back to isolationism. So there's this huge U.S. debate about what would be a better path. And Eisenhower says, I want to run for president to make sure the U.S. stays the police of the world, stays active in the world. We saw what happened when the U.S. turns to isolationism. And that was basically World War I and World War II. So we can't go back to that, Eisenhower says. So I need to run to make sure the U.S. is involved in the war, actively involved through NATO and the UN. And what do we think? And really, at this point, do you think isolationism is better? The U.S. staying out of the world's problems? We save money and lives maybe when we do that? Or should we be actively involved? And Eisenhower, we know what decision he makes. So now let's explore kind of his run for the presidency, his decision to run. In 1928, Hoover was president, and then FDR won in 32 and 36 and then 40, and FDR won again in 44, and then in 45, Truman won. In 45, Truman took over for FDR when he passed away, and then Truman won the presidency in his own right in 48. But the 1952 presidential election, everybody's asking, including Truman, for Eisenhower to be the nominee of their party. And Eisenhower says no to Truman. He says, I've always been a Republican. Everybody in my family's been a Republican. So I'm going to run as a Republican to become president of the United States. So Eisenhower's campaign strategy at this point is what's known as K1C2. And what that basically means is Eisenhower says, elect me because I will do what Truman can't. I will win the Korean War. Because the Korean War at this time had been going on and on for seemingly 2 years. And Eisenhower also says, vote for me because I will deal with 2 C words, and one would be communism. I won't let it run amok like Truman and the Democrats have. And basically, he's not going to contain communism, Eisenhower says. He's going to take the fight to communism, free Eastern Europe. Now, the second aspect of Eisenhower's campaign is going to be C2, which is corruption. I will stop corruption in the U.S. government. Now, to give a little background on that, one of the aides for Harry Truman was a guy named Harry Vaughn, and he was an aide that raised money for the Democratic Party by allowing top donors to stay overnight in the White House. Now, what was this? There's a place called the Lincoln Bedroom in the White House, and what Harry Vaughn was allowing to happen is these huge Democratic donors could pay money. They could then spend the night, sleep in the White House in the Lincoln Bedroom, and that would allow them to have conversations and close access to Truman for at least 24 hours. And and people said, that's corrupt. You're letting people pay money so they can influence our government. The Democrats are corrupt. They're accepting money. So Eisenhower says, I won't allow that to happen. Weirdly enough, plenty of presidents have done this exact thing since this moment. But in the 1952 election, it was sold by the Republicans as being a corrupt practice, and the election occurs. And of course, this is one of Eisenhower's ads. Vote for Eisenhower.
President, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum.
So Ike, of course, was the nickname for Eisenhower. At this point, it was a nickname that he got in the military. So I like Ike. Now, what's going to happen? Well, who knows who's going to win? But Eisenhower has another decision to make. Who's going to be his running mate? That could be anybody to run for the vice presidential position. Now, Eisenhower was reasonably old at this point. So when you choose a running mate, you want somebody to balance you off. You want to get somebody young on your ticket. That's typically what they say when you pick a vice presidential candidate. You're balancing the ticket. Now, another example of balance when you choose your candidate, Eisenhower, by many standards, was a moderate Republican. He wasn't too conservative, and that made members of the Republican Party nervous. So they needed to get somebody super conservative, and that would be a guy named Richard Nixon. He was both young and super conservative. So Nixon is chosen partly because he's a super anti-communist. He got famous through his investigations through HUAC and going after Alger Hiss. He did take down Hiss. Now, this was, remember, 1952, the height of the Red Scare. So basically, Eisenhower needed somebody that was huge against communism. And so you could say that Nixon and Eisenhower made kind of a balanced ticket and a great team. But suddenly in 1952, there became an unexpected problem that Eisenhower did not expect. The Democrats accused Nixon of basically having a slush fund, accepting money from donors and using it for himself, not for the campaign. So Eisenhower's like, maybe I should get rid of Richard Nixon, kick him off the ticket. And he was very close to doing that. until Richard Nixon went on air and gave a televised speech known as the Checkers speech, where Nixon basically said, I haven't accepted illegal money. He actually showed his bank accounts and the money he didn't have, that he was reasonably poor. He showed the car he was driving, which was a terrible car at the time, or should I say one that was breaking down. He's like, if I've been stealing money, would I really be this poor? And in the end, he kind of says, I did accept one illegal gift from a donor, but I'm not giving it back because my children love it. And it was a dog named Checkers. And of course, you can see the dog right now. So it was basically kind of tongue-in-cheek, making kind of a joke out of it. But it made the country kind of fall in love with Richard Nixon. And Eisenhower's going to be like, you know what? That was a great speech. The public loves him and trusts him now. I'm going to keep him on the ticket. And with Nixon on that ticket, the election continues. And Eisenhower goes up against a guy named Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee, and he crushes him. Ike wins in what we call a landslide victory. Crushes. The Democrats only receive votes from the South. Eisenhower wins everywhere else. So Eisenhower is now going to be president from 53, at least for the next 4 years. Now, decision number 6. Republicans are a little frustrated with the memory of President FDR. FDR is going to win 4 straight elections. And at the end of the election, FDR's doctors had even said, there's no way he's going to survive. He's got less than a year to live, yet FDR still won that election. So basically, at this point, the Republicans were pointing out that we have in our system, the fact that people can keep getting elected over and over again leaves them too powerful. Even if they're on their deathbed, the American people will still vote for them. And that's too much power for people to accumulate. So even if they don't deserve the presidency, like FDR, they still get elected in that last term. So the Republicans proposed an amendment called the 22nd Amendment that provides term limits, basically saying from now on, presidents won't be able to get elected for more than 2 terms, typically 8 years, and the 22nd Amendment will actually get passed. So that's a big question today, though. A lot of people are like, no, that's not democratic. If the American people want to elect somebody for a 3rd term, they should be allowed to. People felt that way about Ronald Reagan in the 80s, Bill Clinton in the 90s, George W. Bush in the aughts, and then maybe even Obama after that. So should we have term limits, or should the people not be allowed to elect somebody they like for a 3rd term? So that's a big debate. Now, decision number 6 of Eisenhower during his time, Eisenhower was worried about government spending, specifically that we were going in massive debt ever since World War II, creating this huge military. And ironically enough, Eisenhower had been kind of the head of that military. So Eisenhower's like, I can fix this. I can balance our budget. Deficits weren't so readily accepted back then as they might be today. So Eisenhower says, us spending more money than we have, creating these deficits is a problem. Part of the problem is our army is way too big, and our navy is way too big, and we have too many military bases. And this is leading to us being too quick to fight regional wars like the Korean War. And if we keep getting involved in all these regional wars, we're going to be sucked into spending massive amount of money, wars that we can't afford. We're already bankrupt and don't have enough money. So Eisenhower even points out that getting sucked into these containment wars and all these regions of the world, we can't win them anyway. As the Korean War kind of showed, China has way too many people. The Soviet Union has way too many people. We can't win conventional wars against them. Person versus person, they just have too many more people than us. So Eisenhower proposes a new look at the U.S. military, and the new look is going to be the name of that policy, where the U.S. military needs to be contained and made smaller, and the Navy has to be smaller. And the way that we can make our military smaller and avoid regional wars is basically by creating more nuclear weapons, having smaller armies, smaller navies, but more nuclear weapons, backed up by a policy known as massive retaliation. Massive retaliation basically means that Eisenhower and our government will, anything that the Soviet Union does wrong, anything, whether small, medium, or large, we will threaten the nuclear option. We will threaten nuclear war with them. And the idea is if somebody gets threatened with nuclear war, they won't take land. They won't invade South Korea in the future because they know it will lead to nuclear war. So Eisenhower says, I am going to massively retaliate on you. I will bomb you, and then you won't do anything. And because the Soviet Union won't do anything anymore, we won't have regional wars. We won't need a large military. We won't need a large navy. And the U.S. will save money and have a balanced budget. So this concept of massive retaliation is kind of a good deterrent. Who's going to attack us? Or the Soviet Union won't attack us if we're threatening them with nuclear war. But also, there's a consequence. It raises tensions, which totally happened in the 50s and early 60s, because we're constantly threatening nuclear war with them. I could understand why they'd be upset. Consequence number two of massive retaliations, the period of time known as brinkmanship occurs. It always seems that we're on the brink of war, and that's very dangerous. If you're going to threaten your enemy constantly, that's a bluff that if they call it, you're now involved in nuclear war. Brinkmanship is a negotiation tactic. Some people don't like brinkmanship. They think that when you have an enemy, you should look for common interests and compromise to create the peace and lower tensions. But Eisenhower said, no, I'm going to raise tensions. I'm going to threaten them. And that's going to be the deterrent that keeps us peaceful. Peace through strength, through power, through threats. So if you're ever negotiating, you kind of have to decide what's the path you believe in. Brinkmanship, threaten people to create the peace, or compromise, try to find common interests and peace to have peace. So consequence number three, skip this for a moment, is kind of with a smaller army and smaller navy, we're going to have less of a flexible response. We're not going to have that many options to take on the Soviet Union. Like, for instance, in 1956, when Hungary tried to have a revolution to kick the Soviet Union out, we only could threaten them with nuclear war. We couldn't take smaller steps like sending troops and supporting them in a different way. So we're going to really ultimately not have many options, and we're going to have to, since we didn't want nuclear war, we're going to have to let the Soviet Union crush Hungary's revolution and reestablish communism in Hungary for another 20, 30 years even. Just no options when you put all of your eggs into the nuclear basket. So again, which is the more prudent foreign policy? Brinkmanship, threats to get the Soviet Union, your enemies, to do what you want, or should it be compromise and trying to build a better relationship? And that's something that you should kind of have in mind, because I'm sure you're going to be negotiating things all throughout your life. Decision number 7 of Eisenhower in the Cold War. In 1950 to 54, the U.S. had a problem, and that would be Joseph McCarthy. And we've already studied this. We were under the Red Scare. Massive accusations of lots of innocent people. Innocent lives were destroyed. Mass paranoia and chaos. And our country was really being torn apart by the Red Scare. Eisenhower, the most powerful Republican, never stood up to McCarthy. Why didn't he stand up? And this is one of the biggest criticisms of Eisenhower. He was worried he'd lose votes. Basically, all of that hostility and those threats and creating fear made the American people not trust the Democratic Party, and they trusted the Republican Party, the party of McCarthy, to solve and go after communists and catch them. So almost this Red Scare was good for the Republican Party. In 52, they took over the presidency, the House of Representatives, the Senate, most governorships. So in the end, Eisenhower didn't want to stand up to McCarthy because it was good for business. So some people say that's a consequence of his integrity, because Eisenhower knew that McCarthy was making unsubstantiated threats and was tearing the country apart, and innocent people were getting hurt. So you could make an argument that he should have done something. So really our question here is, when somebody else is doing something wrong, but the results are benefiting you, should you still feel obligated to put a stop to it if you can? And Eisenhower kind of dodged that. He kept his head down. Red Scare in action. I think that's one of the top critical things of Eisenhower. Now that said, moving on, Eisenhower decision number 8. During World War II, Eisenhower was in Germany and he saw the massive highways that Germany had, the most famous Autobahn system, right? No speed limits and so on. Now Hitler created this for military movement so he could move his military around quickly and be efficient with his military choices. And Eisenhower's like, we're in the middle of the Cold War. We need to be that efficient as well. So Eisenhower is going to pass something called the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. This would be the largest spending bill, domestically anyway, non-war related, the United States had ever had to this point. The idea is we were going to copy Hitler and build these massive highways so that we can move our militaries around, so that we can evacuate civilians from cities if we ever need to. Because at this point, we just had a bunch of small town roads everywhere that were congested with traffic and couldn't move anything quickly. So Eisenhower proposes that bill, and it's going to be the huge impetus behind it. And today we have one of the most successful highway systems in the entire world. So again, problem is though, if you're going to build highways, you want to avoid traffic, and you have to build roads in a very specific way to make them efficient for military movement and civilian evacuations, and even just economic development. Because remember, time is money. If you build a huge highway system, suddenly now businesses can sell their goods quickly to everywhere around them, and that's going to stimulate our economy to make us an economic superpower in the 50s by these highways. But in order to do that, you need efficient roads. So the highway bill specifically said the federal government will pay for these highways, but they have to be good roads. That means people are not allowed to walk on them. There's no parking areas allowed. There can be no traffic lights. There can be no intersections, just on ramps and off ramps. And that will make efficient roads, and efficient they became. And that's what you notice about highways today. All of those things. All those highways have numbers, and if they are even, then they are going west to east. That's why you can take Route 90 all the way from Boston to Seattle. And if you want to go down to Miami, you can take Route 95 from near Boston all the way down to Miami. So that's how that's done, and the economic impact is huge. Once again, if you're a business and can only reach the areas around you, you can only sell a little bit of your goods. But if you can quickly reach the entire country, you're going to sell millions of your goods, and you're going to start hiring people and expanding into factories, and that's huge. So this is going to have a huge economic impact as well. And the United States will become that economic superpower. Now, there were some problems related to this Highway Act of Eisenhower's, and where do the roads go? People already lived everywhere. Cities were congested. So the cheapest land of people that had the least political power were through poor neighborhoods. So most of these highways are going to go through poor areas around cities, and that's going to be taking land from minority owners and, of course, people of low income. And today, people really point out how those homes were torn down and taken from those people, and those people lost their homes. And that really wouldn't be tolerated, this type of political action in 2021. But back then these people were somewhat disenfranchised and did not have the power to keep their homes from being taken. This whole concept of the government taking land in order to do something that's good for the collective country is called eminent domain. Eminent domain is when the government could take your property to build something like a railroad or a highway. It still happens today. So what do you think? Again, was this Highway Act worth taking people's homes and tearing down all their land? And was there a more fair way we could have done that besides just putting these highways through poor communities? Again, huge decision. Now, decision number 9, the 1956 election is going to be a rematch between Adlai Stevenson and the very popular Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower is expected to win because the economy is going well. People have jobs and money. He ended the Korean War when Truman could not. Maybe the biggest issue of the 56 election that people debated about was Eisenhower himself. He had a heart attack in 55, and he was basically the oldest president we've ever had up to this point. And he will become in the second term the oldest president we've ever had. That's since been beat by Ronald Reagan, then Donald Trump, then Joe Biden. But either way, his heart attack made people worried. Eisenhower almost didn't want to run. What happens if he had a heart attack in the middle of a nuclear strike? That would be terrible. But he ends up running anyway. He thinks that he's healthy enough to do so, and he dominates even more than the first time, crushing Adlai Stevenson, and once again, except the South. Now, either way, he's elected for the next 4 years. But in 1967, this problem of Eisenhower, Americans were worried about it for the next 10 years. And then when Kennedy was shot, people got even more worried about the role of the vice president. The president has issues. So we ended up passing 10 years later the 25th Amendment. And the 25th Amendment basically had a couple parts to it. It formally said that the vice president becomes the actual president if the president dies. But the part that I want to talk about is the second part, the disability piece, that if the president ever has a heart attack or becomes disabled or becomes crazy, the vice president and a majority of the cabinet have the right to forcibly take the presidency away from the president until at a time the president can prove that they're sane again or healthy again. And that's been used a multitude of times since, where presidents have had surgery and the vice presidents have taken over temporarily. So that would be the 25th Amendment. Never been used forcibly. But decision number 10 of Eisenhower, U.S. imperialism in Iran. Iran is going to become very important in the early 1950s. So let me talk about Iran for a second. Iran in 1900 had a huge desert, and there was oil discovered underneath that desert. But Iran was somewhat poor at this point. They didn't have the technology to get at all that oil. So they asked for help from a country they were very close with, the British. And the British brought in their technology and their know-how, and they got the oil from under the ground. Now, of course, the British, though, got most of the money from that oil, while Iran collectively stayed as a very poor country. It's kind of seen as an act of economic imperialism. So Iran, over time, begins to get more and more unhappy with this deal, and they have kind of an internal struggle in Iran. And that internal struggle kind of is between the Shah, that was very good friends with the West, the United States, and the British, and a guy named Mohammad Mossadegh, who became prime minister of Iran in the late 40s, early 50s. So Mohammad Mossadegh, as prime minister, says, we have to stop this economic imperialism. And he passes a law that nationalizes all of the British oil fields and all the British refineries and so on. Takes all of the oil from the British. This makes the British angry. This was their refineries, their technology. They spent money to do this. Now, the United States is also unhappy because at this point, the Shah, who is kind of the royalty of Iran at this point, flees after supporting the U.S. and being against Mossadegh and the nationalization of all of this oil. So on top of that, I mean, the United States is frustrated that the Shah has fled. But at this point, Mohammad Mossadegh realizes that his relationship with the West, the British and the U.S., is failing. So he begins to get close to the Soviet Union, begins to begins to expand trade with them, developing diplomacy with the Soviet Union. And of course, Truman has a containment policy where he's like, I can't allow the Soviet Union to move to Iran. But in 1953, we get a new leader. I'm sorry, I kind of misspoke. Truman, while very much against this and wants to contain communism, is not willing to take aggressive military action. Truman was distracted by the Korean War. He didn't need another war in Iran. So he does very little to stop the Soviet Union from moving into Iran, at least informally and diplomatically. But in 53, we have a new sheriff in town, Eisenhower, the subject of this presentation. And he says, I will do something. I will act where Truman did not act. I will get rid of the Soviet influence in Iran. And he begins covert operations. Now, the goal of the covert operations of sending the CIA into Iran is basically to get rid of the prime minister that is hostile to the West, Mossadegh, and put the Shah back. The Shah at this time is in exile living in Italy. So the CIA goes in, actually, I think it's Teddy Roosevelt's either son or grandson, and Operation Ajax is implemented by the CIA. So the CIA under Operation Ajax is going to take money and begin to buy off the leaders of the Iranian military. Because again, if you can take over the military of a country, prime minister doesn't have much power. Going to pay off political leaders to lead a coup to overthrow the elected prime minister of Iran. So those protesters start to rebel. They have a coup. The CIA actually pays to have buses, school buses, to bring in all of these protesters into Tehran, the head of Iran. And that is a picture of the literal Iranian coup of 1953. Those people are angry. They're threatening violence. Look, they're holding weapons. They're coming in on these military tanks. Remember, we paid off the military leaders of Iran. And they start blowing stuff up. And they actually storm the political building in Iran. And they take Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister, they basically charge him with a crime and arrest him. They charge him with treason and they lock him away. The Shah now returns under the coup and takes control and power, kind of rules with an iron fist over the next 20 years, in return and becomes kind of a puppet to the West. Oil gets put back in the hands of the US and the British. In the consequence, the Soviet Union is shut out of Iran. Now, another consequence is hatred grows. Eventually, the Iranian people learn that their elected leader got tossed out by the US in our covert operations, and hatred of the West and hatred of the British and the US grow. And that's going to basically peak in 1978 when Iran has another revolution to kick the Shah out and put their own leaders in charge. And a bunch of Americans within a year are going to be taken hostage. And that's going to lead to a huge crisis of the late 70s, early 80s. But we'll get to that later. So the CIA at this point thinks they're all powerful. They took over a country, and that's what the U.S. did. Now, I would say, should the United States, when we perceive that a hostile leader is in charge of another country, and they're becoming dangerous to us, should the U.S. take covert action to kick out their leadership and as a way to make the world more accessible to the U.S. and safer for the U.S.? Should that be a job of the CIA and the U.S. government? Or is that just imperialism? And is that taking the sovereignty away from a group of people? And that's wrong. So you should kind of have that opinion. Decision number 11, another foreign policy issue. In 1951, Guatemala, which is located in Central America, had a new leader by the name of Arbenz. He's well liked by his people. He established a minimum wage to help the poor people out, established democracy in elections, and a full suffrage for women. But then he takes his liberalism a little too far, and he does something called land reform. He basically says if you own more than 673 acres, that will be seized by the government and basically redistributed to the poor. The U.S. sees land reform as an act of stealing from the wealthy, but also as a communist initiative, because communists love land reform, taking from the rich to create equity for the poor. So this, of course, is not seen positively by the United States. Also, Arbenz is very friendly with other communist countries, countries like North Korea, China, and the Soviet Union, and we can see the writing on the wall. Arbenz must be a communist, although he never publicly came out as one. So in 1954, we're like, not in our backyard. Communism will not be allowed to grow in the Western Hemisphere. Monroe Doctrine and all. We need to find a way to kick Arbenz out, just like we kicked Mossadegh out of Iran. So the real impetus behind this is most of Guatemala, believe it or not, was owned by a U.S. company called the United Fruit Company, and they owned the harbors, the railroads, just so much land. They employed so many people. And if land reform occurred, they would be the biggest losers. They would lose like 90% of their land and power. So that, they didn't like it. And weirdly enough, the head of the United Fruit Company, was related to the head of the CIA and had connections to the State Department, and called up, basically called up and said, we got to do something about that. So that's what's going to happen. And in the age of McCarthyism, where basically McCarthy is saying Eisenhower is not doing enough to fight communism in the world, Eisenhower had to do something, right? So the CIA was super confident. They just overthrew the leaders of Iran. They could do anything, so they're going to try to. Now, another reason why the U.S. is going to be motivated to basically overthrow this Guatemalan ruler is paternalism. This country, of course, is filled with non-white individuals that are less educated, have less technology, and they don't know as much as the United States. The U.S. knows better, kind of that home white man's burden. So paternalism, this kind of racist mentality that we know better, we have better technology, we're better educated, we know what's right for the Guatemalan people more so than their own leaders, their own people. So that's going to drive the U.S. kind of wanting to overthrow them. In 1954, the CIA is going to go in. We're going to take a kind of Guatemalan exile, a guy named Armas, and we're going to give him money, and we're going to give him money to raise an army of 480 people, and we're going to supply them with weapons and even train them in Central America. The CIA is going to train them. And then June 18th, 1954, we send this group in to invade Guatemala. Now, the problem is the army's too small to take on the Guatemalan army. But the CIA has a plan. We're basically going to do psychological warfare. We're going to create a fake war to make Arbenz flee so we don't have to fight and defeat him. So the CIA pays off church leaders to preach against Arbenz. We drop leaflets from the sky making Arbenz look evil and like a communist, and that our invading force is larger than it is, so they have to flee anyway. CIA mailed wooden coffins to supporters of Arbenz, non-functioning bombs to the millions to supporters, hangman nooses to supporters, basically saying if you don't leave now, if you don't abandon Arbenz, you're going to be dead. We took over radio stations and did fake radio transmissions, actually, so that every home heard our invasion force, that 10, 20, 30,000 people, they're conquering everything, they're winning all the battles, they better flee now if they support Arbenz. The U.S. military secretly did air bombings of Guatemala City, basically making it look that like the U.S. was going to invade at any point, that this military was taking over the city. There was no hope so that they would flee. Hundreds of fake articles written in newspapers that the military of Amar's invading was winning and going to take over the country no matter what, that the enemies needed to flee, that the U.S. could invade at any moment, but wasn't going to. And at this point, Arbenz, all of his leaders and the people that supported him, realized that there was no hope that this army was going to take over the country. They fled, or they left him, or they lost support for Arbenz, and Arbenz himself is going to flee and give up. And communism is stopped, and that group surrenders, and now Guatemala has a new leader, at least in the short term, that's not a communist. He gets rid of democracy. So a lot of people argue that the U.S., yes, it stopped communism, yes, put a puppet in charge for the short term, but the consequence of that was he was a terrible ruler. Guatemala is going to be stuck in civil war. Democracy is going to be ruined. And ultimately, Latin America is going to know that we did this, and resentment is going to be created against the big brother to the north that's always trying to mess with Latin American affairs. So this is going to kind of destroy the U.S. reputation in Latin America, our involvement here. And Latin America is going to begin to get turned more and more hostile into the 50s and 60s against the U.S. And that harms the U.S. It's also going to make the CIA, again, feel that they're gods. They overthrew Guatemalan leaders and Iranian leaders. And that's going to lead to overconfidence, which leads to the Bay of Pigs mistake, which we'll study soon, which leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Bad CIA. So again, we need to reflect, should the United States covertly overthrow leaders that we see as threats? Or is that violating their sovereignty and an act of imperialism that the U.S. shouldn't do? If you were president, what would you do? Now, decision 12, we're getting near the end of the presentation. But in 1955, Cold War tensions are up. Everybody, massive retaliation, brinkmanship and all. In 1955, in Geneva, Switzerland, we have a little peace conference, and Eisenhower actually proposes an open skies program, because what he's trying to do is prevent misunderstandings. At this point, most people in the Soviet Union, and even much in the United States, are farmers. Yet all of the propaganda makes the U.S. think that the Soviet Union isn't spending most of their time working and being teachers and plumbers and farmers, but instead most people in the Soviet Union are just training to invade the U.S. at any moment and start World War III. So everybody thinks that, and the Soviet Union people, because of their propaganda, think the U.S. is just constantly looking like the individual to the right here, ready to fight. When in reality, in the U.S., most people are peaceful. If we could only get through the propaganda and see each other, then we'd be more likely to be peaceful with one another. So Eisenhower is going to propose a program called Open Skies, where both the U.S. and the Soviet Union are allowed to fly planes over each other so that we can see that both sides are not mobilizing troops, and both sides are just acting peacefully, and this would lower tensions if we got to know each other. Also, we would get to, again, see that neither side was moving troops, and if we were able to fly over each other's countries wouldn't be able to mobilize troops, and therefore attacks like Pearl Harbor would never happen, and therefore countries wouldn't actually enact invasions like Pearl Harbor, and we could avoid war. So this is what it's all about. So in 1955, Eisenhower says, let's have open skies, let's open the air. And Khrushchev says, absolutely not. Terrible idea. You're just trying to spy on the Soviet Union. I won't let it happen. So Eisenhower is crushed. This was his big way to create peace, lower tensions. But Eisenhower says, we need to know what's going on in the Soviet Union anyway to make sure they're not doing all these terrible things. So Eisenhower basically continues a program that had been started called the U-2 program, the development of a plane that is so light and has such a wide wingspan, as you can see, that it can fly way up high and not be discovered and take pictures of the Soviet Union so we know what they're up to and are they developing missiles and are they dangerous. So these planes, the U-2s, can fly so high that they basically can fly higher than any missiles the Soviet Union could launch at them. They can fly higher than Soviet MiGs can fly, so they can't be shot down. In fact, they're even higher than Soviet radar at the time. So the U-2s can fly over the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union will never even know they're there as they're taking pictures. So from 1955 to 1960, the U.S. is going to fly 23 of these U-2 flights over Soviet territory and then other flights over other areas. And we're going to actually photograph 15% of the Soviet Union, particularly where their military bases are. But things change. In 1960, there's this huge accusation by John F. Kennedy and the Democrats that Eisenhower screwed up. There's a bomber gap. The Soviet Union has so many more bombers and so many more ICBMs than the U.S. has. And Eisenhower has failed and the U.S. is in danger. So on May 1st, 1960, going into another peace conference, Eisenhower orders another U-2. And this is to once and for all kind of prove that we are not behind. The Soviet Union does not have more missiles. And Eisenhower gets Gary Powers, who's already done a bunch of U-2 missions, to basically leave Pakistan, fly to Norway, and photograph all of these military bases to get more information on the Soviet Union and how many ICBMs they have. So, problem is, in these 5 years, the Soviet Union has significantly improved their rocket technology. Their SAM, surface-to-air missiles, are much better. Their radar is much better, even better than the U.S. And on May 1st, 1960, Gary Powers flies over the Soviet Union, takes a bunch of pictures, and then gets shot down by a SAM site that fired 3 missiles. And as Gary Powers is flying, Eisenhower is like, tells the world, yep, we got one of our planes got shot down. But don't worry, it's not a spy plane. It was a weather plane that accidentally went over the Soviet land. And yeah, the weather plane got destroyed and went down. We're so sorry about that. So he lied to the world. So at this point, Nikita Khrushchev actually has an advantage because he actually captured Gary Powers and he had the wreckage and he had the spy photos from the wreckage. So at this point, he exposes Eisenhower, tells the world, that Eisenhower is a liar, that he lied to the Soviet Union, he lied to the world, he did an act of espionage, he's been spying on the Soviet Union, which violates international law, that it's not the Soviet Union that's evil, it's the US that's evil. And the world condemns the US for spying, or should I say much of the world, and for the lies Eisenhower was telling. So at this point, this is where context is important. Under the rules of brinkmanship, the Soviet Union and the US are so close to World War III. Things are so hostile in 58, 59, 60 that we plan a summit, the Four Powers Summit of 1960, to try to decrease tensions. It's been 5 years since that last peace meeting, and there's so much hope in this 1960 peace meeting that maybe we can avoid World War III, avoid nuclear war. And one of the huge goals was arm reductions and peace. But the U-2 incident, where Gary Powers got shot down and Eisenhower refusing to apologize, and Eisenhower lying about it, Khrushchev walks out of the peace summit in the first day of it and says, yeah, I'm not meeting with you if you won't apologize. And at this point, we were really in a lot of hostilities about Berlin. The Soviets were saying, get out of West Berlin, and we were saying no. And everybody's threatening maybe nuclear war and other issues. So we really needed this peace conference to decrease tension. But instead, the opposite happens. The U-2 incident of Gary Powers getting shot down, tensions dramatically go up. So Eisenhower had been invited to visit Moscow. We were really on the road to peace, and now that gets redacted, basically rescinded. Khrushchev's like, I'm not taking you into the Soviet Union. So, I mean, basically hostility is peaking in 1960 and so on. Now, whatever happened to Gary Powers, who was shot down? Well, he lived, parachuted down. He was supposed to, he had this coin on him that had this little injection needle that would have ended his life. That way he couldn't have been forced to embarrass the U.S. by the Soviets couldn't get him to admit that he had been spying for the U.S., but he didn't take it. So he was captured, and then he confessed, and he was put on trial. Here he is, Gary Powers, on trial, and he was sentenced to basically 10 years of hard labor and imprisonment. So 19 months later, we actually got him back. We exchanged a spy we caught with a spy, Gary Powers, and on this very bridge, what happened is that each group put their spy on one end, and they walked across the bridge, met in the middle, and kept going. So some people said that Gary Powers, for confessing that he was a spy, was a traitor. Other people say, no, he's a hero. This whole business was captured in the movie with Tom Hanks and Bridge of Spies, a very good movie that I highly recommend. So in Moscow, you can even go to museums today and see everything they got from Gary Powers, all of his stuff. The U.S. asked for it back. The Soviet Union said, no, we're keeping it. So come the 1960 presidential election to replace Eisenhower, the stakes were really high, tensions were high, and we really need to make sure we pick the right candidate between Kennedy and Nixon, or maybe we might find ourselves in nuclear war if one of these two people doesn't handle problems that well, because we are close to nuclear war in 1960. So the objective of this presentation was for you to reflect on Dwight Eisenhower's major decisions and what would you have done, but also to set yourself up to be able to create a matching quiz based on all of Eisenhower's events and decisions during his presidency. So we talked about a whole lot of things that Eisenhower was involved in. There were also a lot of things we didn't talk about that Eisenhower was involved in. We'll hit that at another time. So again, look for your assignment in Google Classroom related to that matching quiz, and have a fabulous day.